Is Cuba now closed to Americans? Not, and here's how to go. Hey How To crew, it's me Andrea. So back in August, I went to Havana for the first time and I absolutely loved it. And I was so surprised at how easy it was to go as an American. So I was telling everyone, you gotta go, you gotta go. And then November 9th happened, and everyone's like, wait, can I still go? Which was a very good question that I did not have the answer to, and it seemed no one had the answer to. So I've gotten those answers. So this is how to go to Cuba post November 9th. It's as simple as book a flight, and all travel services, fees, insurance, all that stuff is included in the airfare. And if there's a pop-up that says, do you understand the travel restrictions? Click yes. Well, if you've watched this video, yes. You book your hotel or Airbnb. Again, if there's a pop-up, you said yes, you understand. Then you go to the airport and you buy your visa at the Cuba Travel Services kiosk for $100. And you also get a white sheet of paper. So behind me is the visa desk. I just did that and it took a whopping 4 minutes. So they're kind of telling you that you need to get in super early, which you can because there's no online check-in for Havana. But as you can see, there's no one there. Then you go to the bar, if you're like me, you fill out the pink visa. It has to be pink if you're flying through the US, regardless of what citizenship you have. Then you fill out the white sheet of paper asking you, why are you going there? Then you go to board the flight and the ticketing agent will take your white sheet of paper, look at it. In my case, didn't say anything, board the flight, bada bing, bada boom, you're in Cuba. It was really, really, really that easy. Now, where all the confusion and all the stress happens is that white sheet of paper. What box do you check? What box do you check? There are 18 boxes to check, but none of them say tourist. One of the main misconceptions is that President Obama allowed for Americans to travel to Cuba as tourists under a tourist visa. That has never been true. You've never been allowed to travel to Cuba as a tourist. Well, since the early 60s. It's all about this one box, educational exchanges, people to people. And to explain it, I spoke to John Caulfield, who couldn't be more of an expert. He served in the State Department for 30 years and was the chief of the U.S. interest section in Cuba, our quote-unquote embassy, from 2011 to 2014, and actually worked with the Obama administration on these rules.
One of the categories, people to people, to interact with the Cuban people, to learn more about Cuba, that category used to be restricted to organized travel groups. And at the very end of the Obama administration, they said, well, people can just make up their own trips. They don't have to go with a travel agent or on an arranged tour. And that's the regulation that Trump changed by reverting to what it was before the end of the Obama administration.
So what exactly happened November 9th?
New regulations were published for Americans traveling to Cuba, and they said two things that were important. One of the categories you could travel to Cuba on was people to people. The rule is now that you must go on an organized trip. There must be a travel organizer that puts together your tour. And then the second thing is that if you go to Cuba, you're not allowed to patronize establishments owned by the Cuban military. The Cuban military owns a lot of hotels and some restaurants.
But there is good news. If you booked your trip, including a blacklisted hotel before November 9th, you are allowed to complete that trip, including checking the people-to-people box. But if you don't want to trust me, trust John's word.
If you had made your plan, booked your flight, made hotel reservations before November 9th, then you're not subject to the new regulations. You're allowed to complete your trip under the rules that existed before.
Now, it's only if you haven't booked the trip yet that you have to fall under one of these categories. And it's really up to you and why you're going to visit Cuba. So I'm going to explain a few of the popular choices. So let's start with the category I checked, journalism, which I could still go on if I booked today. But I was told by John was the worst thing that I could have possibly filled out.
The Cubans are very sensitive about journalists reporting on their country. And they normally require journalists to go with a journalism visa that's issued by the Cuban embassy in Washington, D.C., which is difficult to get. However, in your case, it looks like you got through without too many troubles.
Probably because this licensing form is only for the US. It never makes its way to Cuba. It's given to the gate agent and they may, or in my case, did not question me, and then you board the flight. When I went, there was no Cuban equivalent of this form. You just needed your visa and passport. The person that I traveled with checked support of the Cuban people, and they've done that in conjunction with giving toiletries, water. It's an option. But here's John's rules for clicking that box.
Assistance of the Cuban people is going to require on the U.S. U.S. side, that you have a pretty detailed explanation of where you're going, who you're going to be helping, and you can't be helping people on the beach in that category.
But let's say you're not as adventurous of a traveler as I am and maybe don't feel like you could check one of those boxes. These are ways that John suggests you can go to Cuba.
The easiest way is to sign up for one of the people-to-people tours. There's plenty that are advertised on the internet. The travel provider, they will assure that you stick by the rules. In other words, you only stay in hotels that are approved and you only eat in restaurants that are not owned by the Cuban Armed Forces. But I think the next way is, if you're a member of any religion, look into trips that churches might sponsor to Cuba. You don't have to be a church official or anything like that. You can simply go with one of these groups. And then for students, there are academic programs, there are exchange programs that you can go to Cuba on as a student.
If you're still like, I don't know if I want to go, here's a different perspective from someone who's been there post-November 9th.
It's an American regulation that they seek to enforce on the ground in Cuba. I don't think there's anybody from the Department of Treasury sitting in the lobby of the Kempinski figuring out if that's an American at the bar buying a beer.
Oh, and if you want to contact John and Miles and maybe even go to Cuba with their humanitarian group in Novadores, you can.
I think that there's a great other audience of millennials that want to discover what's going on down there, and that's why I wanted to take the interview.
Cuba is still open. Only a few things have changed, and the hotels I'm going to be getting to in another video. But I really want to encourage everyone to go right now because it will be a little bit more difficult to go as an American. Alaska Airlines, who I went through LAX, said that they're going to be suspending service in January 2018 because they anticipate demand is going to go down. And listen, where there's a will, there's a way, and you guys absolutely should go.
2014, former President Barack Obama announced that he and Cuban President Raul Castro had begun the process of normalizing relations between the two countries. Part of that agreement included lifting some of the travel restrictions for United States citizens, which would then allow them to travel between Cuba and the U.S. for the first time since 1963.
We're moving ahead with more opportunities for Americans to travel to Cuba and interact with the Cuban people.
However, for many Americans, there are still more questions than answers.
So who can go to Cuba? The actual answer is just about any American can go, especially on a cruise ship, if you perform to the Treasury and Commerce Department regulations. And what are those? You have to sign an affidavit claiming that you're going under one of 12 approved, sanctioned ways to go. People to people, educational, research, journalism, etc. Most people pick people to people.
But in June of 2017, President Donald Trump announced that he would be tightening travel restrictions to Cuba, eliminating individual people-to-people or educational trips. These visits had been previously defined by travelers having meaningful conversations with Cubans, or visits to places where they could learn about Cuban life and culture, while exploring Cuban cities on their own. The Trump administration then required travelers to book a trip with an official tour operator, and those could include cruise ships and commercial airlines that complied with the new policies. Of course, if you fly to Cuba on carriers like American, Delta, JetBlue, or Southwest, you'll need a hotel room. And the influx of American travelers to Cuba has left rooms in short supply because the Cuban hotel infrastructure has just not caught up with the additional demand for accommodations.
But cruise ships don't need a hotel. They're their own floating hotels. And as a result, anywhere between 2,000 to 7,000 people a day are roaming the streets of Havana, coming ashore at ports like this that can barely accommodate even one ship.
On this trip, I sailed on the Carnival ship Paradise from the port of Tampa.
And then about 18 hours after leaving Florida, the ship arrives in the iconic harbor of Havana, sailing right by El Morro Castle.
The new regulations will likely have little impact on ships like the Paradise, because their passengers sign up for approved and structured shore excursions before disembarking the ship. They can choose to experience the sights and sounds of Havana, or explore the country's colonial past, or even visit the famed Tropicana nightclub, which was a favorite watering hole of Marlon Brando and John F. Kennedy. There are lots of cruise lines sailing here, like Regent, Norwegian, Royal Caribbean, Azamara, Lindblad, and even a small luxury yacht line, Group IST. And with so many cruise lines visiting the island, there are itineraries lasting just a few days and others that are more than a week long. And they're at every price point. You can go to ports like Cienfuegos, Santiago de Cuba, and Trinidad. But of course, the most popular port remains Havana. It's a city that almost prides itself being trapped in the 1950s and conjures up notions of romance and adventure, art, music, tropical daiquiris, and of course, Ernest Hemingway, who lived and wrote here for nearly 2 decades. As a matter of fact, one of Hemingway's favorite hangouts was El Floridita, which also claims to be the home of the daiquiri. And to avoid any confusion, there's a handwritten plaque on the wall making it clear where he preferred his drinks. I've been coming to Havana since 1978, nearly 40 years. That makes me one of the lucky ones because I've seen all the changes and I've also seen the things that haven't changed. And one of the things I always do every time I come here is I make a point of coming to a place that's been here since 1930, the Hotel Nacional, once owned and run by the mobster Meyer Lansky. But why am I coming here? For a very important family reason. Back in 1947, my parents actually honeymooned here. And a couple of years ago, I actually found the room number where they honeymooned. I got the hotel to open the door, I went in the room, guess what? Other than a legacy touch-tone phone and a color TV set, nothing had changed. And that, in essence, is the beauty that still remains of Havana.
Our next stop will be in the Revolution Square. O también conocida como la rampa, 23 Avenue, better known as la rampa. Mi animación.
Now to an NBC News exclusive on those alleged sonic attacks against American diplomats in Cuba. For the first time, the Cuban officials investigating those incidents are speaking out, denying their country had anything to do with it. To our chief foreign affairs correspondent, Andrea Mitchell, who went to the Havana neighborhood at the center of the mystery.
Tonight, the U.S. Embassy in Havana virtually shut down. U.S.-Cuba relations in an escalating crisis. Now 24 American embassy staff have reported mystery ailments. President Trump blaming the Cubans.
But I do believe Cuba is responsible.
Now in their first interview, Cuba's investigative team, top security officials and a doctor pushing back. Did you do it?
Without hesitation, I'm telling you no.
The colonel says they've had nearly 2,000 people looking into the charge that U.S. diplomats were targeted by a sonic weapon, suffering a range of symptoms: hearing loss, headaches, nausea, even mild traumatic brain injury.
Cuba doesn't possess this technology. Cuba has never produced these types of weapons.
Let me play for all of you the sound that... This is what some diplomats reportedly say they'd heard. But a document the Cubans provided to NBC News says that audio was not at acoustic levels damaging to health. And American experts telling us there's no known technology that explains these symptoms.
There's never been any kind of physiological response that reflects the symptoms that have been reported that have been ever caused by sound waves of any type.
And this is the room. We went inside the hotel room where one of the incidents was reported. He said there were vibrations through this window. Another diplomat lived here and many others nearby. The Cubans say they interviewed more than 300 neighbors, conducted dozens of medical exams, took air and soil samples, studied insects, toxic chemicals, and electromagnetic waves. Nothing panned out.
Not even one person was sick.
Not even one person in the neighborhoods was affected the same way. What about speculation Cuban hardliners are to blame to derail diplomatic relations? They say no way. Or perhaps a third country, Russia. No other country could have done this.
We don't have definitive answers yet, but Cuba has never allowed, nor would we ever allow, our territory to be used in this way.
The Cuban doctor in charge frustrated that the U.S. won't let him talk to the American doctors on the case.
Medically, let us do it together. And let's find what is happening, because they are people that are sick. We want to discover why.
Well, today, the FBI was in Havana meeting with the Cuban investigators. U.S. officials tell NBC News that in a classified briefing, administration officials did not blame Cuba for the incidents when they went to the Hill, even though President Trump is holding them responsible. Lester?
But both sides still think it's a mystery.
A mystery, and the Cubans denying that they have anything to do with it.
Andrea Mitchell, thank you.
That building right there is the American Embassy. Come on, show me the American flag. U.S. Embassy. And Cuba.
What? No? I'm sorry, I didn't know we couldn't take photographs. What can we take photographs of? Okay. Lo siento.
Ah, la foto, la picture?
Yeah.
Yes.
You say no?
No, hurry up, hurry up.
Oh, okay. Gracias.
Mira, pero no está desde ahí.
Ah, sí.
Move, chat. This way, lovey. Thank you. Thank you.
The streets of Havana turned into rivers by Hurricane Irma. Canoes, not cars, are now the best form of transport here. At least 10 people have been killed in Cuba by Irma, which has now been downgraded to a tropical storm. The death toll in the Caribbean now stands at 38. Don't have anything. We've lost everything, she says. The fridge, the washing machine, we've lost everything in here. Irma barreled into Cuba late on Friday, and with winds of up to 260 kilometers an hour, is the first Category 5 hurricane to make landfall on the island since 1932. Millions have been left without electricity. Waves of up to 11 meters crashed into Havana's historic seafront boulevard on Sunday.